Good afternoon. My name is Anna Kate Reagan. I'm majoring in American Studies, and I'm currently a sophomore. Our speaker today, Robert A. Sirico, is co-founder and president of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty and the pastor at Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish and Academy. He received his Master of Divinity degree from the Catholic University of America following undergraduate study at the University of Southern California and the University of London. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Financial Times, the Detroit News, and the Washington Times. He has been a guest on numerous television and radio programs on CNN, ABC, CBS, NPR, and the BBC, among others. A member of the Mont Pelerin Society, the American Academy of Religion, and the Philadelphia Society, Reverend Sirico is the author of Defending the Free Market, the Moral Case for a Free Economy. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Robert Sirico to the stage.
Well, it's good to be in Jerusalem. I am really so delighted to be with you tonight, and I have a number of students from my parish school, Sacred Heart Academy, who are here. There just seems to be a nice symbiance, especially given the fact that, I'll just guess 80% of our teachers are graduates of Hillsdale as well. So it's good product here. When I was in seminary, those many years ago, taught by the Apostle Paul, I think, part of our curriculum, part of our formation, wasn't just academic. There was that dimension to it, but it was also pastoral. How do you deal with people? And part of the work that I was assigned to do in 1 year was to work with the poor, and this meant I was at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and we would go and serve the poor in the inner city of Washington, D.C., which meant Anacostia. And here's how it went. On Fridays, a seminary buddy and myself would go get on the train and subway and go to Anacostia. And there we met a sister who ran a soup kitchen in the basement of a Baptist church. And she was very entrepreneurial. What she did was she contacted all of the churches in Chevy Chase and the various areas of surrounding Washington, D.C., and so she'd write to the Presbyterians, Lady Auxiliary, or the Ladies of Baptist Group, or the Catholic Rosary Society, or whatever it was, and she'd say, we need from you 300 meals once a year. Your ladies can make food for 300 people, and we will serve them. So I imagined what went on was that the ladies in the Holy Rosary Society of Chevy Chase, Maryland, would give the recipe to their maids, and the maids would prepare the dinner and hand it to the chauffeurs who would drive it down to us in Anacostia. Now, I don't know that really happened, but this was my Brooklyn fantasy going on here. And the seminarians would arrive. Sister said to us, now, here's what we do here. Your job is to set up the tables, put out the food, make sure it's warm and heated, put out the food, clean up after you're done, clean the whole thing up, and remember, whosoever will may come. We don't ask anybody any questions about their status, their life, or anything. They just come and they get something to eat. And so that was the agreement, and we did that. And usually what would happen is we'd set it up and we'd get it going, and then we could sit down and maybe have a meal with people who were there. And different chores. I remember once I was bundling together some garbage and went out to put it in the trash bin. And I noticed that a cab pulled up and two ladies got out, and they had shopping bags with them. And I just kind of greeted them. I said, hi. She said, are we time to eat? I said, yeah. She said, can we get to the front of the line because we have to go, there's a sale we need to make. I said, whosoever will may come. Sure, ladies, come on. So they went downstairs, and we would work this. And one Friday, Joe and myself, my classmate, were finishing up, and we hadn't eaten anything because the Baptist ladies sent chili on a Friday in Lent, right? So good Catholic boys, you know. And I said, Joe, you know, when we get back to the seminary, the sisters are going to have closed down the kitchen. So if we're going to get something to eat, we'd better get something before we get home. And I said, there's a fish and chips place I saw right down the street. Maybe we can go there and get something to eat. And he said, okay, we'll go do that. So we went to the fish and chips place. It was after the lunch hour. And as we walked in, there was a man kind of cleaning up the tables and sweeping out things, and a young girl helping him. And he came over to the table and took our order. And I noticed he passed it through the kitchen window, and there was a woman in there, and she was frying up the fish. And immediately I realized, oh, this is a family. And then it dawned on me, this is a family who lives in this neighborhood. This is a family that lives in this neighborhood who run a business in this neighborhood. And I am their competitor on Fridays. The advantage I had is that we didn't have to pay for our food. We didn't pay for the insurance. We didn't pay any of the salary to anybody. Sister worked for free. We worked for free. No light bills, nothing like that. We had no problem. This family on Fridays had less customers because we were there doing charitable work in their neighborhood, and we never asked anybody who came to us what they needed. And I'm sitting there eating with my seminary buddy, and I said, Joe, a thought has just crossed my mind. And he said, what? I said, we are this guy's competitors. We're making life more difficult for this family in this neighborhood. He said, you're a heretic. I said, no, think about it. He said, well, what are we supposed to do? He was from Brooklyn, too. What are we supposed to do? I said, I'm not sure. This thought is just occurring to me. It's a very uncomfortable thought because we have all the best intentions in the world. We want to help these people. But the problem is we don't know these people. We don't know the kind of help that they need, and we don't ask them. We don't ask them to contribute anything. We don't ask them to bring a little food. We don't ask them to help us set up. We don't ask them to help us clean up. We don't know anything about them. There's no rationing of any sort going on that a price system would normally provide for. That has always remained a question for me. How do we combat that? So my topic today is to talk about Christianity, social justice, and poverty. And that thought immediately came to my mind, the complexities of serving people. Serving the vulnerable, serving the poor. You see, it's not just good intentions. We need something else. We need, if we're talking about feeding people, if we're talking about people who are poor, then we're talking about economics. We have to bring sound economics to questions of good intentions. And if we don't, we can make a real mess of the whole thing. Somebody wrote a whole book on this called Poverty That Hurts or Kills. So that was my seminary experience in the soup kitchen long before I founded the Acton Institute. But the Acton Institute, in a lot of ways, grew out of that concern that I began to see on many, many, many levels, not just soup kitchens in inner cities. We need something more than good intentions. I want to talk first about the nature of Christianity, because that's the moral backdrop in which a lot of people debate these kinds of questions. Even if it's not an explicit religious argument, you notice that when we have political arguments about the cost of education, the cost of health care, the questions of shelter and clothing and the well-being of people, it all takes place in front of the backdrop of a moral question. What ought to we be doing as a society? What kind of a society is a moral society? What kind of a society is a society appropriate to human dignity? That's really the question that we're facing in many, many ways. And Christianity in particular, of course, when I say Christianity, I mean it in its Judeo-Christian reality, because Christianity is the younger daughter of Judaism, the Jewish people, the Jewish covenant, being the inheritance of Christianity. And the whole anthropology, the whole view of the human person that comes out of this biblical idea. And it's really incredible when you think about what these ideas formed and what they grew into over a period of roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years. In Christianity, what is the main claim of Christianity is that God became one of us. He joined at a certain point in time and entered human history, that the eternal God commingled with the human race, and not from outside the world, but he broke out of the material world in the incarnation when he was born in Bethlehem. Think about what that means. That in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the prologue of John's Gospel, and the Word became flesh. This enfleshment is the core foundation. It's the way in which Christianity views everything else about itself, its sacraments, its social engagement. It has to do with the goodness of the material world, and in a real sense, this is a reiteration of the book of Genesis. This is why I think it's very important to keep Judaism and Christianity together. You can't separate the two. In the Garden of Eden, when God created man and woman, he created them after having formed all things from nothing into being and pronounced the material world good, and then creates man, who is a composite of heaven and earth, the dust of the ground and the breath of life, and then gives man and woman as his first word spoken to the human race in the Garden of Eden, a vocation. And that vocation is to tend the garden. Notice, by the way, we won't get into environmentalism, but notice, by the way, that it was a garden and not a jungle. And what's the difference? The garden needs tending. The human being is not unnatural to the environment. Some people will argue that like we're the only unnatural thing on the planet. Everything else needs to be preserved, but human life is dispensable. But I digress. And yet, it informs what we're talking about. Because this view, both of the Old Testament in the book of Genesis and in the New Testament in the doctrine of the Incarnation, says something about the sanctity of the material world, that God had an intention for the material world that he created. He reiterates that intention in the incarnation of his Son. And what begins to happen, what begins to unfold, is not just an idea, an abstraction, but an institution. It's called the church. The church confronts society and culture and builds culture and confronts history with the message of her Savior. Part of this message is the dignity of the human person, an anthropological vision that each human being, from the first moment of their existence until their natural demise, is the possessor of a dignity, that each person is unrepeatable, each person is unique, each person bears the image of God, the imago Dei. Each person is created in that image of God for eternity. That is who the human person is. Now, that idea began to be fleshed out in an institutional form. And what that meant was that when Christianity began to confront human beings in their vulnerability, whether they were widows, whether they were orphans, whether they were profoundly handicapped or near death, whether they were diseased, regardless of their race, that the Christian would always confront that person as though they were confronting Christ himself, because Jesus said that. To the extent that you do it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. So the encounter with the poor and the mind and the assumption of the church is an encounter with Christ himself. And we see this not just as a theological concept, but we see it very early in the church's history. Even right outside of the text of the scriptures, we begin to see it. There was a plague that broke out in the city of Antioch. And there's some historical material related to this where the legion guard, the captain, whatever he was, wrote back to Rome and said, look, there's a plague that's broken out. It's spreading. I've pulled back the troops so that they wouldn't get caught in the contagion. Of course, the politicians had already left. He said, and even people's families, even physicians are leaving people because of this contagion. But one strange thing is happening. There are a group of people, this cult following Christ, who are staying with the dying. And they're tending to them at risk to their own lives. Now, this is just a soldier reporting to his superiors. Right there, of course, you remember in the Acts of the Apostles in Antioch, that's where they were called Christians for the first time. They're living out what Christ did himself. This intuition to associate oneself with the dying, with the vulnerable, with the poor, with the broken, because of Christianity's belief in the incarnation, the seriousness with which God took history and culture and the material world, began to form itself into institutions. First, very small, very informal. It would happen, I think in the early Middle Ages, that people, when plagues would break out or people were dying, they would bring them to convents. And very often the convents would have some extra rooms, and they would bring the dying, and they say, we don't know what to do with these people. Medicine was very primitive. Would you take care of them? And so they would receive them in, and the sisters would take care of them. And in the process of taking care of them, they would develop systems of sanitation, cleaning, refreshing the bed, keeping air circulating. The sisters and monks did this too. They began also to prepare these very primitive recipes that were medicinals. Today we enjoy them. They're called limoncello, sambuca, chartreuse, all these wonderful digestivis. But these really, all of these things were originally medicines, herbal medicines to help people. And hit and miss, they began to work with people, and they found some things worked better than others. And this was first called hospices, and then later in more institutionalized forms, hospitals. The invention of hospitals is a Christian invention. Not only that, but consider this, that institutionalized and internationalized organized charity is the result of Christianity because of the organizational system of the church and the various places that the church existed. And the idea that charity was done not to people because they were Christians. Charity was done because we were Christians, because we could encounter Christ anywhere. Human life was sacred. These ideas came out of this anthropology, of this cosmology that we find in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Universities come out of this experience. If you read any of the great historians of of ideas. Today, we are harangued by a secular culture that's trying to tell the church how to do charity when institutionalized charity is our invention. And all they have are secularized, desiccated forms of charity that aren't even that generous and certainly aren't even that effective. And here's why. Because what Christian charity did in connection with the poor was to see the person as a whole being. That is to say that they were material, they had needs. If they were hungry, or if they were sick, or if they were tired, or if they were whatever it happened to be, to tend to those material needs, but that they were something more than that. They were also transcendent beings. They were also beings destined for eternal relationship with God. They were spiritual beings. And this holistic view of who the human person was gives a fuller understanding of how to deal with that person. In other words, to put it a different way, unlike secularist forms of charity, we don't treat people just as though they were animals, just as though they were material. When an animal is cold, you take it in out of the cold and put it in the barn. When it's hungry, you give it some hay. When it's thirsty, you bring it to the trough. Because that's the total existence of an animal. It's material. The human being transcends the material. They are material, but there's something more than physical. And because of that, there is love. There is bonding. There's an understanding that when a person comes to us in need, that there's a whole context that must be provided, and not just the material. The material, again, is important, but it's not the whole thing. And the secularist versions that only when they confront poverty, very often in the form of a young woman who has become pregnant and outside of marriage and has been kicked out of her home and doesn't have a high school education, what will the welfare state do? It will give her an abortion, or it will give her contraception, it will give her food stamps, it will give her some counseling, but it won't bond with her. It can't bond with her. And this is why Christianity knows something, not just about poverty, but about the poor. But there's something else embedded in the biblical view of human life that's very important. And that is that the material world is sacred and can be the occasion for honoring God. And that the bearer of the image of God also is bound to the world primarily by their use of reason. And that we can work in this material world so as to produce more than we consume. And this understanding of humanity is very different than the zero-sum form of humanophobia that we see at the United Nations and very often in the halls of Congress. The fear that if there are more human beings on this planet, there's going to be less of the pie for us to all eat. It only sees the human person as a mouth that consumes, and not also as a mind that produces, that is creative. How can it be that a man who has 10 pigs is richer than a man that has one, but a man who has 10 children is seen as poorer than a man that has one? Now, we see the human person as the source of creativity. That man, as St. John Paul II once said, man is man's greatest resource. And that to marginalize the dignity of human life and to see human life, or more human life, children, as a threat to economic productivity is a fallacy, and a dangerous one at that. How do we counter this? What do we do in the face of it? We deal with people who we know. We bond with people who have needs, and needs that because we know them, we know their needs. This, in my tradition, is called the principle of subsidiarity. In the Reformed tradition, the great Reformed theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper called it sphere sovereignty. Now, there are technical differences between sphere sovereignty and subsidiarity, but let me articulate to you what I know best, that this is in the form of subsidiarity, what it's talking about. It'll sound very familiar to you. Basically, what subsidiarity says is that needs are best met at the most local level of their existence. This political societies of higher complexity ought not to intervene into lower forms of society, except in cases of dire emergency, and even then only temporarily. To put it simply, needs are best met at the most local level of their existence. To put it simply, if I have a need, I have the first responsibility to meet my need. But if there's some collapse in me for some reason or another, then it's my family's responsibility to respond to that need. And if there's a collapse there, then our extended family, our cousins, our relatives, maybe our neighbors, maybe our churches, maybe other mediating institutions in society that are independent of the state, all of these need to be the first to be permitted to act on behalf of those who have needs, precisely because these are the people who know the people best. They know if there's a real need or if you're just putting on an act. They know what that need is. If it's a meal, or if it's love, or if it's counsel, or if it's a good swift kick in the behind. Because we all have different needs, and unless we know each other. The real sinister thing, in Italian, sinistra means left, by the way. The real sinistra, the real sinister thing here is that the welfare state, in the name of the poor, disables the poor very often. It disincentivizes the rest of society to act first. Because there's an intuition, because resources are scarce, there's an intuition that says, well, if their need is going to be met by this group of people or this agency or whatever, then I'll go and do something else. And look at what happens. Society begins to fragment. People are no longer bound together by bonds of concern and love in the way that Alexis de Tocqueville saw when he visited the United States and documented it in Democracy in America. Americans always organizing themselves in some kind of social group to meet various kinds of needs. No, authentic community is the result of a vibrant and strict implementation of subsidiarity. This is the solution. The wealth creation of a free economy combined with vibrant communities of moral concern without regard to specific denomination. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and we had as many different religions going on, mostly Jewish and Catholic. Okay, I'll give you that. And a few Protestants were over there, but they lived in other neighborhoods. But we worked together on projects that we saw as important because we were neighbors to one another. We had a multi-ethnic experience without a government mandate to have one because we were generally left free to form communities. Friedrich Bastiat, in his wonderful little book, and any students here, well, this is Hillsdale, you probably already read it, The Law by Friedrich Bastiat. It's online. It'll take you an hour and a half to read. It's a wonderful book because it doesn't teach you what to think, it teaches you how to think. And one of the things he talks about, fraternité. Fraternité, fraternity, brotherhood. One of the things he says in that book is, you can't force people to be brothers. To the extent you force them, they're no longer brothers. That it has to be something that is free, something that is invited, something that is compelled not by government, but by morality. People talk a lot about social justice today. It's a well-used and abused phrase. Let's remember that Aristotle gives us a very clear definition of what justice is. Justice is to be treated in accord with desert. To the extent that there is social justice, it is society treating society, that is people, communities of people treating each other as they deserve to be treated. But let's be very clear, societies don't act unless people act. Societies can't be informed or imbued with either vice or virtue. It's people who are the vicious or virtuous. So to the extent that we're talking about social justice, we need to be very careful that people aren't smuggling into that idea the notion of socialist justice, which couldn't be more of an oxymoron than anything else. We see that historically. We see it today in Venezuela. We see it in North Korea. We see it everywhere that socialism has been attempted in our world. The injustice of brutal regimes to decide for people how their lives should go. The real temptation in a morally sensitive heart is to respond to people in the simplest way that they know how. Let the government do it. The problem is, the simplest way isn't always the moral way. The real way to build a society that is just, a society that is imbued with a sense of something more than justice, a sense of charity, a sense of love, is to allow people to get to know one another, to act freely, and to be formed by our moral vision. This is not an easy undertaking. The depressing thing is that the very people in our society, religious leaders in particular, and business leaders as well, who ought to understand how this works, very often don't understand how this works. To see religious leaders abandoning their vocation to tend to the needs of the poor, to tend to the needs of Jesus Christ, who comes to us in distressing disguises, and hand that over to the government, is abominable. And for business leaders to likewise betray their vocation to be creative and productive with the talents that they have been entrusted with, and seeking the benefit and advantages of the state, is an equal betrayal to the clergy who abandon their vocation to the state. Now, my friends, we need a different kind of society. We need a society that understands that piety is never a substitute for technique. I wish I had written that line, but I didn't. It's from Etienne Gilson, who was a philosopher. He said, if you want to build the facade of a cathedral that represents the rising of the soul to God, like Notre Dame, you must first understand geometry. And then he said, piety is never a substitute for technique, for without technique, piety is helpless to make use of nature for the glory of God. We need a society that is imbued with a moral sense and that has a high respect for the technique of business. A moral sense of business, a sense of business that is imbued with the kind of anthropology that I spoke of earlier. C.S. Lewis spoke so beautifully of this kind of anthropological vision, this vision of the human person, when he said, you have never met a mere mortal. In The Weight of Glory, he wrote these lines. You have never met a mere mortal. Everyone with whom you have ever come in contact, every shop girl from whom you've ever purchased anything, anyone who you've ever had a fight with, anyone you've ever quarreled with, anyone you have ever loved or hated, is either an immortal horror or an everlasting splendor. but you have never met a mere mortal. And then Lewis went on to say these words: the most sacred thing that presents itself to our senses, next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, is our neighbor. This anthropology comes from a Judeo-Christian vision of how the world was formed, how human life came to be, and the dignity that each human person possesses intrinsically in their very nature. This is the kind of society that we must propose against the ideology of division and class warfare, against the claims of Marxism and socialism and its variants. No, we must respond to such ideas with the insights of someone like Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who once said, "We should not judge the rich. We do not advocate class struggle. We advocate class encounter, where the rich save the poor and the poor save the rich." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Sirico. We now have time for Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to the microphone.
Thank you. My question is, would it be a good idea for all people, instead of just physicians only, to ask themselves before they take an action, first, do no harm?
Not only would that be a good idea for everyone to do it, it would be especially a good idea for physicians to do it again today, because I understand that's been taken out of the Hippocratic Oath. Did you take that out of, did you take that vow?
First, do no harm?
Do no harm?
I tried to do, and when you think of...
No, but I mean as part of the Hippocratic Oath.
No, sir.
Are you a physician?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were. No, I think they have removed that in the modern sense. But of course, yes, first do no harm. Absolutely, absolutely.
Should I go? Sir, in consonant with what you have said so very, very well, I just want to make a comment on a book by Samuel Cahill, an Irishman, who wrote the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. And the last sentence in that book, after describing all that St. Patrick and Columbo and others did to rescue Christianity on the continent, the last sentence is, the ills of our world will not be remedied by the Romans, that is, the soldier, but by the saints.
Mm. I believe that. Yeah. I believe that. And I think we need we just celebrated All Saints Day on the 1st of November. We need to all be saints.
Right. Hi. My question is concerning wealthy Christians, or specifically Christian business owners who have the power to set wages. And especially...
Could we stop right there just for a moment? I'm going to let you finish.
Absolutely.
But I think there's an assumption that you just made that is economically erroneous. So you said business owners who have the power to set wages. How are wages set? Does the fat businessman with the cigar and the tuxedo and the top hat say, we will pay them this?
Maybe if I'm sort of going to talk about that in the question. You want to let me finish it? Or?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was wondering, specifically regarding the employees, some of whom, might be in poverty or struggling with costs of living. How does a business owner sort of navigate the teachings of capitalism, which would advise them to maximize profit at all costs, versus the teachings of Jesus Christ, which calls us to alleviate suffering and help those in poverty?
Good. That's a good question. I'll stay there because I want to walk through this with you. This is kind of like my soup kitchen. It's filled with the right intentions. It's filled with good intentions. But this is why I wanted to stop you at the first point, but now you've given me 2 or 3 other points to work with. So let's kind of walk through this and see. First of all, you're concerned with people who have a marginal income, who have a difficulty with the cost of living. You are concerned with their wages, which would help them with their cost of living. And you're concerned with the business owner who hires people and what he pays them. Those things are interrelated, intimately interrelated. And you see that because you say, well, if we could raise their income, they could have more things that they need in life. But the way in which a business owner decides what he charges someone is the same competitive principle as the wage earner in terms of what he is going to buy in a given store. In other words, the price of the good that that wage earner produces, the worker produces, is not arbitrarily determined. It's determined in context with what the supply and the demand of the service or the good or the products to produce the good is. In other words, if an employer arbitrarily raised the wage scale of the worker would produce goods and services that would also have to increase in order to make that ends meet. That would mean that all the other workers would have to go to the market and buy those goods and services. Let me finish and then you can come back. They would have to buy those goods and services at higher prices, and they would have to then go to their employers and ask for more higher wages. Now, if, on the other hand, we allowed the prices of goods and services to exist at the real level, that is, the real cost of their production, whether it's in terms of payment for employees or the harvesting of the resources from society or shipment or advertising or whatever else it is, if we allow the price structure to be free, then we know what the real cost of things is. If we inflate it arbitrarily, we distort all that. Now, having said all of that, we still have people who have a hard time making ends meet. How are we going to solve that problem? We're going to solve that problem by creating as productive and as wealthy a society as we can, where people who are wealthy can both hire people, but also give to those people with the profits that they have. So it's all interrelated, and if we pull or obfuscate any one part of it, we throw the whole thing out of coordination, and then what ends up happening is Venezuela, is the Soviet Union, where you have an oversupply of things that nobody wants and an undersupply of things that people desperately want. Go ahead.
Thank you for the response, but I sort of disagree with I said thank you for the response. But I sort of disagree with the premise, so maybe a concrete example would help. So imagine I'm a business owner, I'll use round numbers, with like 50 employees who make $20,000 per year each, which is a poverty wage. And that business profits me, say, $500,000 per year, right? I could make the decision to forgo a certain amount of that profit, say $250,000, and pay each of my workers $5,000 more per year, which would alleviate a lot of their suffering. Do you think how do you see that problem? What would you advocate for a business owner to do? And that wouldn't raise the cost of the commodity.
Okay, Mr. Business Owner, let me ask you this. Do you have any ambitions to grow your business? And what portion of that, how much did you say you were making, $500,000?
Yeah, just...
What portion of that are you spending on your boats and your cars and your rings versus reinvesting in your business? Or let me ask you a simpler question. What is the average profit of any given business in this country? You don't have to be exact, but give me an idea. Give me a general idea, because what's your percentage of profit? And that $500,000, what's the percentage of your profit?
I have no clue. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, about 2%. 2% I'd invest in a company for 2%. Yeah, it's 2-3%. You got some economists here who could spit this off very easily. It's not what you think it is. This, by the way, you know, I didn't say this here, but you read my book. I was on the left for a number of years when I was in my 20s. I worked with Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden in the Campaign for Economic Democracy. Come on, it's my past. I've repented. I've repented. I've gone to confession. They still want me to do the penance. And when I was talking with somebody, the thing he said to me that shocked me was, what do the richest people do with all of their money? I said, well, they have boats and they have rings, they have cars. He said, no, the vast majority of that money is invested in business. So what I'm suggesting to you, if you really were that business person, taking half of your profits would mean you'd cut your growth of your business by half, which means your goods and services that you provide to the market in general would go up, and your employees would lessen. In other words, you wouldn't be able to hire more. You wouldn't be able to hire their cousins and their relatives. Is that okay? I'd like to continue, but got other people. We can talk.
Thank you. What you're saying earlier was basically to put on the mind of Christ, which is really hard to do every day. Mm-hmm. Could you give us...
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
I go to confession every other week.
Yeah. Anyway, I wonder if you could give us some examples, although you did say that doing the work at the localist level is the best way to meet the needs of the people and get to know the people and what their needs are. But could you give us some examples of some organizations that do it right, that do it best? You know, what are some good models for us?
I will, but let me just clear up one kind of assumption that people always have. And here's my real heresy coming out now. Here, this is the big one. Poverty is not solved by charity. Charity needs to exist in extreme cases when there's a dire need and whatever. Poverty is solved not by charity, not by even the best charities, but by business. The expansion of business, the globalization of business. The world has risen in the last 150, 200 years out of poverty at an astounding rate. If you look, you've seen this. This is Hillsdale. You've seen the hockey stick, right? You've seen how most people throughout all of history lived at that level, and then about 150 years ago it began to go up and up and up and shoot right through the roof. And what accounts for that is not charity. It's business. Business provides jobs. The great rabbi, was a medieval or Renaissance rabbi, Maimonides, had this ladder of charity, you know, how to help people. And the top two levels are give, the most moral thing is give anonymously. And then the top level is render a person without need of your charity. Business well done is the most charitable thing that we can do. Now, having said that, there are tons of charitable organizations in the United States. I think Salvation Army is a good example. In my parish, we take up a second collection every week, and that money goes to the poor, by which we mean we have a group of about 20 people in our parish, and it's bound by our geography, so we don't send this money all over the world. It's just people we can get to know, and it's very leveraged giving. So if it's a working family where the car is broken down, we repair the car. If it's a family about to get evicted for one reason or another, we put the deposit down on the thing. And these people get to know those people, and we invite them to come to church. They don't have to come to church, but, and I've seen a few people show up in church. Sometimes we'll help them with adoption questions or childcare questions and things like that. So it's not brain surgery. It's just really getting to know people. But there are great organizations. I can give you a list of them.
So you were talking earlier about how both a free market framework of business and also a local kind of attempt to give charity is always going to be superior to a top-down government institution.
Almost always, yeah. I mean, I'd be interested to hear an example where it isn't. But
no, I completely agree with that. That seems entirely true. But in the world around us right now, there is definitely an increasing encroachment of the massive top-down institutional government structures that you were talking about. And even more than that, it seems like they have a very different, almost antithetical anthropology of what the human person is that's completely different. They have completely different ideas of what the human good is. And despite a lot of outspoken voices against it, especially recently, it seems like it's growing at a very rapid pace. So on the ground, what are some practical tools that you suggest for fighting this thing? It doesn't seem like it's slowing down at all right now.
Yeah, well, I would make two observations about it. The crisis is horrendous. People don't understand who they are. They just really don't understand who they are. If you don't believe me, I give you drag queen story time. I mean, this is just people, and I don't mean just the drag queens. Leave them alone. I mean the parents who bring the kids to these things. There is a deep anthropological insanity in our society. Now, that's the bad side. The good side is it can't last. But there's another bad side. It can last long enough to do a lot of damage. What is the solution to that? Hillsdale College, Sacred Heart Academy, the academies, the schools, the homeschooling parents, the other kinds of colleges like Hillsdale. All of these little platoons, these little groups of people who still assure one another, we're not nuts. They're nuts. And we have to build the wreck again. We have to build up from it. But we are advantaged in the sense that at least we know some things. I mean, at least Adam Smith wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations. We know how this thing works. So hopefully the collapse won't be as deep, although, it frightens me. Here's what frightens me. And if I offend anybody here, I can live with that. No, but seriously, what's frightening me is that some conservatives are becoming very enamored statist solutions to things. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I don't care whether that's right wing or left wing. It's the power you have to worry about. When people get power and don't let go of power, when there isn't a dispersion of power, when there isn't a kind of subsidiarity. And remember, business people, and to my colleague, my friend there who was talking, I am not canonizing business people as such, any more than I'm going to canonize the poor as such. There are business people who are greedy and who make deals with people who can make deals. Nobody comes to me. I never get a lobbyist. They never come to me. Now ask yourself why I don't hear from lobbyists. Because I don't have political power. That's why. Crony capitalism is antithetical to real capitalism, or at least to real free markets. Let's use that word, because I don't like the word capitalism. So these are the things. All of this can be solved by right ideas. And so institutions like this are the place to promote those right ideas. And the family, of course.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really beautiful. This question might be a little bit silly given some of your last answers, but given your focus on local institutions and things, would you see distributism as a viable answer to the welfare state?
No, I don't. I think distributivism, for those of you who don't know what it is, it sees itself as a third way between capitalism and socialism. And the articulations, the best articulations, I suppose, of distributivism come from G.K. Chesterton, who wrote remarkably little on the subject, and Belloc. And there are a few other writers, but these are the chief writers that people have reference to today. I think distributivism, to the extent that it is most cogent and persuasive, is not an economic theory, it's an aesthetic theory. It tells us that we can't be mechanized, we can't be subordinated to just systems, that we have to be personal and creative and cultivate authenticity. But that's not an economic system. I think if we put in place tomorrow a real distributivist model, even an ideal model, to the extent that Chesterton has any practical models, which I don't think he really does, I think we would have mass starvation in the world, because we need international corporations. We need large global industries, not industries that are bribing governments or being subsidized by governments, but we need coordination internationally through a market pricing, a free pricing system. And distributivism wouldn't allow for that. It would make everything small. Small is beautiful, according to the distributists. And we have too big a world. With more than 6 billion people on the planet, we need big solutions to problems. We don't need micro loans. We need macro loans. We need big industries. And I think that can be done in a moral way that can also have an aesthetic that can critique the kind of soulless business that the aesthetics of distributivism seek to criticize.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you.
We're having so much fun.
It seems to me that there is one word at the core of any religion or at the core of nature, describes it, and that is transformation. We are asked to transform ourselves, but not to transform others. We can help others to transform themselves. That is what you seem to be laying out. Am I close?
Yeah. You're close. You know who put it very well? Let me see if I can get this quote right, because this is one of these quotes that I always manage to garble. It's Winston Churchill said that the socialism of Christianity said, no, the socialism of today says, whatever is yours is mine. And the socialism of Christianity said, whatever is mine is yours. It's voluntary. That's the secret of the socialism, if you want to use that word, which is anomalous, because it's not socialist. It's this sense of sharing and cooperation. So I think that's what you were saying, this transformation. Thank you very much for your time. A pleasure being with you.